Bismillahirrahmanirrahim wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Last week's episode of this podcast is called Prayer of the Oppressed, and it's a reflection on what it means to be human and the human condition and our own universal susceptibility and maybe even proclivity to oppress, to view ourselves as part of a group, and either as individuals or even in our group identity to believe ourselves to be more valuable and more worthy of the claim to human dignity than others. It's also a reflection on what oppression really is in terms of the diseases and the sicknesses within the heart, and also the cycles of oppression and how people who are seen and find themselves being oppressive to others, oftentimes you look in their history, and sometimes their very recent history, and you find that they were also oppressed. And you see that in individuals, in families, in groups, in countries. And it also last week was a reflection on my own personal relationship with those realities in my context. And a lot of what I shared, especially in the beginning, came from the scripture of the Muslims, the Quran, and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with regard to how the human beings became human. And so if you haven't heard that episode and you'd like to have an understanding of where I'm coming from with that conversation, that might be a good one to listen to. I'm very happy with that episode. I spoke from the heart, and so it's not an edited presentation, but it's one where I spoke from the heart. And this week, I would like to share and just continue to reflect on one of the main statements from the Quran that really hits home with me. And it's one that I have spent most of my adult life and my career really aiming with, especially my message and in my work with others, to have this kind of state of being in the world. And it's something that I ask the Creator to make real for me. Allah says in the Quran, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses before the divine, even against yourself and your parents and your kin," which also can mean, according to our scholars, it can also mean, your parents can also mean your ancestors. And your kin can also mean your tribe or the group that you identify with. The Quran goes on to say, whether it's against rich or poor, prestigious or unknown, the Creator, the divine, is the one who's caring for both of them. And don't allow the inclinations and prejudices and preferences and desires within your heart make you miss the mark, make you swerve from doing justice. And if you distort justice or decline justice, then Allah is well acquainted with what you do. End of quote. This sits with me particularly because it's so easy for human beings to recognize injustice and to speak up for justice and to stand up for justice and to work for justice when we're the ones that are being wronged, or when people that we identify with are being wronged. That's very easy. And it's understandable. And I believe that it's praiseworthy. Part of what we're taught in the Islamic tradition is that it's good to have a feeling, to have good feelings about one's own group. You should feel good about your people. You should take some pride in your peoplehood. You should have a feeling of closeness to your family and to your parents and to your ancestors and to your group dynamic, because those things were chosen for us and were given to us by the divine, and we are in fact human. And part of what we spoke and reflected on last week is that the human being is saddled and strapped and challenged and really trusted with a really very, very difficult condition and proposition. It's very difficult to be a human being. And it should be the focus of everything that we do. And we have to meet our needs in the material world. And there are certain obligations that we have to do because we're also in bodies and we're also in societies and we also have needs and we also arrive in the world. We have to, be in the world as it is. And also try to be the best of who we are. And so it's not an easy thing to do. And so our focus should really be about what kind of people are we going to be. It's a very short time between the womb and the tomb. My friend Dr. Cornel West always has this way that he begins his statements. Line 37A of Plato's, the unexamined life is unworth living. And it's a very short time between the womb and the tomb, and what kind of people are we going to be? And what legacy are we going to leave? And so we should feel good about our people. That's a good thing. And it's a natural thing. And so it's easy to stand up for justice and recognize when your people are being wronged. And that's a good thing to do. There's nothing wrong with that. It's oftentimes more difficult and more praiseworthy to see when our own group has the very human experience of finding ourselves in a position where we can and are abusing other people and taking out our pain on others. One of the things that we reflected on last week is that the Quran says that being a tyrant and being an oppressor is part of the human condition, and it's a type of blindness, deafness, and dumbness. And Allah says that it's not the eyes that go blind, but the heart that goes blind. And so when we're in that state, it can be very difficult to see ourselves. It can be very difficult to hear the truth. It can be very difficult to speak the truth and to testify to what's going on inside of our heart. It can be very difficult to do. And it can be hard, especially it can be easy to lose track of what it means to be a human being. And people who have been oppressed globally and identify with the oppressed know all too well, because of their experience in the world, what it means to be dehumanized when you're just seen as being less than human, which is as simple as thinking that a group of people has some defect in their collective character more than someone else, especially a group that we're not a part of. That these people are particularly violent, when we know, when our hearts are alive, that the human being has the potential to be violent and maybe even susceptible to violence, or that certain people are, particularly vengeful or lazy, or, any of the things that exist inside of the human condition. To think that one group of people, an entire group of people, are particularly predisposed to any one of those things is a dehumanization. And one of the things that we reflected on last week, and if this is interesting to you, I would suggest listening to that. But that in the story of the creation of the human being, the angel, Allah, the creator, announces to creation, I'm going to make a creature that will have the ability to make decisions for itself, will have some sort of autonomy and some sort of sovereignty, and can even have the ability to go against their own nature and disrupt their own intention for being. And so the angels asked, can't that be a problem? And the creator says, I know what you don't know, and creates them and teaches the human being the names and natures of everything in creation, and then orders creation to bow in honor and respect for the human being. And they all bow except for one named Iblis, who thereafter is known as Shaitan, or the devil, or the archetype of evil. The enemy, the open enemy of humanity. And the open enemy of humanity, Shaitan, said, when asked, why didn't you bow when I ordered you to bow and honor of the human dignity? And Shaitan says, well, I'm better than him. I'm better than them. I'm created from smokeless fire, and they're created from the dust and the dirt and the mud and the clay of the earth. And then Shaitan's job is to try to prove that the human being isn't worthy of that trust. And what we're told is that the Creator says, I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known, and so I created creation to know me. And so some of our scholars say that this proclivity in the human beings to go off track is what allows them to rediscover the mercy of the Creator, the love of the Creator over and over and over again in our coming back. So our relationship in this Quranic narrative with making mistakes, with oppressing ourselves, with wronging ourselves, with wronging each other, ultimately it brings us back again and again and again to ourselves and to this relationship with the divine, to get right and to repair and to repent. And so Shaitan's message is that the human being is just the worst of who they are. That's what defines who they are. And anytime that someone is dehumanized, that's the way that they're seen. Whatever the worst of that group or that individual has done, that's who they are. And you see this over and over and over again in cycles of oppression. And so people that have lived on the other side of oppression are really aware of that. You know, the police or someone in authority kills a young Black person unjustly. And then the media will rush to find all of the mistakes that that person did. Well, that person was suspended from school. Trayvon Martin was suspended from school. And he smoked weed when it was illegal. And since then, cannabis has become legal in most places. But are being suspended from school or smoking weed or getting in fights, are any of those offenses worthy of the death penalty? And should that be carried out by a person with a gun who just hasn't been charged with any type of authority at all? And why would the news media rush to report that? You know, whereas when a white young person shoots up a school or shoots up some big gathering, immediately the media will start to talk about their own troubled past and their mental health struggles. So those people are being humanized to say, well, yes, they did this horrible thing, but also keep in mind what they've been through. So that humanizes the one person and honestly dehumanizes and blames the victim when they're on the other side of the oppression cycle. So it's easy to see injustice when it's being done to us. It's very difficult to see it when it's done to others. And so we have this statement in the Quran, you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses before the divine, even if it's against yourself, your parents, your ancestors, your people, your tribe, whether it's against rich, prestigious people or poor and unknown people. God is best to take care of both of them, and don't follow your own inclinations, your own prejudices, your own preferences, your own desires that are in your heart, because part of being a human being is having those. We don't have the same relationship with everybody. You know, some people were having this conversation about whether or not white people should be able to say the N-word. And Ta-Nehisi Coates was being asked about it, and he said, you know, I call my wife honey. If you walked up to a bar and called my wife honey, that would be a problem. That would be disrespectful. You know, we'll say, well, you call her honey. Yeah, we have a relationship that you don't have. There's a difference of relationship, and not all of our relationships are the same. And so we do have inclinations, we have prejudices, we have preferences, we have desires in our hearts. And the Creator in the Quran is saying, don't follow those when it comes to areas of justice, and pay special attention to that, because those things can make you miss the mark. Those things can make you have grace, mercy, and humanize the people you identify with, and dehumanize the people that you don't identify with. And if you distort justice or if you decline justice, which are both possible in ways of missing the mark, we can distort justice, we can decline justice. Allah is well aware and acquainted with what you do. And so one of the main takeaways here is, how do we see ourselves in other people? How do we empathize with other people, and how do we identify with the press when that's not our group? You know, personally, in terms of the group that I was born into, legally, socially, culturally, the world in this moment and for the past several hundred years has been governed by a concept of whiteness that robbed our ancestors of their cultures. And when I say our ancestors, I mean people that are considered white. My parents are white. I have a unique relationship with all this stuff because of the fact that I have albinism, and then the experiences that I had in my life, especially when I was very young. And so I have inclinations, and I have prejudices, and I have preferences, and I have desires. But I think that it's really valuable to stand out firmly for justice, even if it's against ourselves and against our people and against our parents and ancestors and against the people that we identify with. And so, and then, I also did a DNA test. My mother was adopted. There was a lot of confusion around where my father's family came from. And I found out that, at least according to the information that they have now, and that stuff changes. It's really not an ancestry test. It's more of, it shows you of the information that they've collected, where are the most matches for people on the earth now. So my wife is she descends from enslaved Africans and also from Puerto Rico. And so in Puerto Rico, they were able to pinpoint the specific town that her abuela says that her family is from. So they nailed it. In Africa, her African origin and ancestry keeps changing on those results because they're gaining more and more data and samples and information. So it changes all the time. So it's really not necessarily an ancestry report, but it's more of a report of who do you share DNA with at this moment that we're collecting these samples. And mine say profoundly England. And so if I look at both global whiteness, which is a cognitive frame, it's one that didn't exist 400 years ago. It's one that didn't exist 500 years ago. I descend from people that had culture and that had spirituality and that had lineages and tribes and ways of doing things that I've frankly been cut off from. I don't know what those things are. I don't have access to them. But I know that they were there because that's what a human being is. But to say, well, what would it mean to identify with oppressed people? Like, what would that look like for white Americans? And so I was thinking about that. What would it mean to make an analogy between what people are going through in the world right now and white Americans? What would it look like for white Americans to be experiencing something like that? Well, first of all, in Europe, the people that left Europe and came to what's now called America, they were fleeing oppression. They were being oppressed. They were being tortured. One of the things I mention all the time is that Resmaa Menakem, a great racialized trauma expert, an expert on trauma in general. Black brother, we had him on the podcast. Go watch that episode if you haven't had a chance to, and check out his work. But one of the things that he makes very clear is that everything that people who are called white did to others once they got to the place now called America first was done to them by other people in Europe. So the landowners and the powerful, prestigious aristocrats and people in power, they're not the ones that left Europe. It was people who were being brutally tortured. You talk about going medieval on somebody. Well, like, what does that mean? All of those tortures, I mean, people being castrated and lynched and tarred and feathered and having boiled water poured into their mouths and all sorts of torturous things that were done to people. Those people having spiritual and religious beliefs that they wanted to hold on to, having identities they wanted to hold on to. They left and they went to another place with the idea that we were going to try to create this beautiful life. And if you look at what they wrote, you see what their intentions were. Their intentions were that all people are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among them is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You see that they were looking to form a more perfect union, that people shouldn't be taxed without being represented. All of these things that we learn in basic American history, those were their desires. Those were their shared collective desires. And they fought and killed people, and they were considered by the governments in Europe, they were considered terrorists. They were considered rebels. They were considered to be people that weren't ethical. They were considered people that had betrayed, that had left their country. And so they sent their armies to America to fight the people there. And eventually they had to fight and die, and they killed each other in order to have a sense of sovereignty, in order to have a sense of being self-governed, of being free. They believed that they were freedom fighters, and they were fighting against people that had tortured them. They were fighting against a power structure that had dehumanized them, to the point that they left and went to another place. When they got to that place, they realized that there were already people there. And you can read the accounts of Christopher Columbus and what he said about them. We can subjugate these people. It wouldn't be hard to kill them. And so you have a long history of what those settlers, what those colonizers, what those people who saw themselves as freedom fighters, as being oppressed in Europe and leaving that place and coming somewhere else. I mean, read a book called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Read the People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Listen to those accounts. Find people, elders in the reserves, the reservations, wherever you are. Find the people in your area and go and talk to them about what happened to them, what was done by European settlers. These were people who saw themselves, and they had this idea that we're going to create this beautiful, shining place, and that all people are created equal, and they had these beautiful ideals. They also wrote into the Constitution that Black people are 3/5 of a human being. And they also, while they wrote those things, they were committing genocide of the First Nations people, the indigenous people, the native people, American Indians. They were committing genocide against them. They were pushing them slowly off their land. And they were enslaving Africans. And they also had indentured servants from other parts of Europe. So there were other parts of Europe where people, this idea of whiteness that really came to be in early America and in those early years, that's an idea that didn't exist before. And on a heart level and on a soul level, on a spiritual level, on a human level, I don't identify with it. And so I have no problem criticizing it, because for as much as people are convinced of the idea that your body means that you're white, that's who you are. And for your own good, you've got to identify with this idea of white. I had experiences early on and throughout my life that have just on a heart level, even on a physical level, I don't identify with that idea. But it's also, they say, race is science fiction, but it's social reality. It's also a reality that legally, and in terms of what's been carried out and actually done in the world, I descend from people and come from people, and also live in a society where white supremacist colonialism is the ruling dominant narrative that governs the way life is lived. And so I also, in terms of, politically, like what should be done, what truths should be aired and spoken, If there's something that a person who's considered and deemed white can do, I'm here to do that. And so I never try to shirk that responsibility. I never try to get out of the responsibility of that. At least I hope I don't. But in terms of on a spiritual level, on a psychological level, on a physical level, on an emotional level, I don't identify with that idea. And it is possible for your society and for your group to tell you that that's who you are and for you to reject it. It also doesn't happen overnight. It's not a process that happens overnight, because that indoctrination happened over the course of generations, and it might not be undone in one generation. One of the things that Resmaa Menakem says is that it's going to take several generations for people who see themselves as white to work through the type of trauma that's been inflicted on them. But the reason to do it is to regain one's humanity and to be a full human being. And so this concept of whiteness that came about during that time, at first it didn't include Italians. It was only WASPs. So when Italians came to America, they were not treated as white. They were treated as non-Black people of color. And in that worldview, this kind of binary worldview of white supremacy, there's people that are white who have all of the benefits of being human. And then there are the opposite of white, which is Black. And those are people who are not respected or recognized as human at all. And in order for those two things to be held in place, for those two positions to be held in place, there's got to be wedge groups in the middle. And that wedge group are people who are not part of whiteness, and they also don't want to be part of Blackness. And so you see over and over again, regardless of who the people are, whether they're it's usually newer immigrants, but they're seen as non-Black people of color. So they're not Black, they're not white. And oftentimes, if they just assimilate into society as in the mindset of the society, the white supremacist colonizer mindset, those people are going to aspire to be white. And so they are going to, whether they realize it or not, as a group, not every individual will be like this, but that group will be incentivized to hold up whiteness and to push down and to reject and to push away from Blackness. And so there were groups like the Italians that weren't considered white because they weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were seen as being these like kind of olive-complected Catholics. They have some kind of dual. They're not going to necessarily be loyal to America, because they're part of a religious community, a global religious community that has its own political base in Rome with the Pope, the Vatican. And so, they didn't want a Catholic president. And John F. Kennedy, who's Irish, who comes from another group of people that came and weren't seen as white, they also weren't Black, and they had an experience of indentured servitude, which was not the same as chattel slavery that was experienced by enslaved Africans and their children. It was a very different thing. It's a very different institution, a very different lived reality, very different experience. But slowly over time, both of those groups were part of the expansion of whiteness, and eventually they became part of the white world, but they weren't always that way. And the same is true of our Jewish family, who came and for a long period of time were not seen as white. And so you have white people in the name of whiteness that committed a Holocaust against them. That was done in the name of whiteness. It wasn't done in the name of any religion. It wasn't done in the name of anything other than the idea of whiteness. Now, the people that carried it out did happen to be Christians. And Christianity is a religion that does not originate in Europe. But at some point, the global power structure of Christianity became part of European white supremacist colonialism. And so it's possible for a religion that has its roots in the non-white world to become synonymous and a part of and useful for white supremacist global colonialism and its projects. And so these were expansions of whiteness that came about. And so if we were to look and say, well, if white Americans wanted to see themselves in other people, the analogy has to be made. What would it mean for white Americans to go through what the Palestinians are going through? Like, what would that mean? And I don't say this to be cute, and I don't say this to be provocative. I say this with the general intention and the sincere desire to see self in others. And for me, this is very easy because I've been a Muslim for 30 years. I've known Palestinian people for 30 years, and I've identified with them, and I've benefited from them, and I've loved them, and I've lived alongside them, and I've also heard their stories, and I've heard directly from them. So this isn't something that I just started thinking about, learning about, talking about in the last few weeks. This is something that, I have followed these accounts, not only on social media, but through people that I've known and families that I've known that have lost loved ones. And I also point out again and again and again, and I always do this, that I was an imam at a mosque when I was really young. And also my family is an Orthodox Muslim family, meaning that we eat only halal meat. We only eat halal food. And in Minneapolis, there's not a huge supply of halal food, but it's also lawful for Muslims to eat kosher food. And so I've always had friends that are deeply religious Jews, and rabbis and Orthodox Jews. And there's a very deep love and admiration and respect there. And there's even the two are really a lot alike. Like the way that Orthodox Muslims live and the way that Orthodox Jews live, there are a lot of overlaps. And it's actually true that their religious law and code is much more strict than ours is. And so what they go through is profound, and I love them and I honor them. And I'll say, I also will say that as I always do, because I'm a person in a body, in a family, in a culture, in a legacy that's called white and seen through the lens of white supremacist colonialism as white, because I'm a person seen as white, I have always paid attention to and kept track of other people that are called white who speak truth to power from within. I'm a connoisseur of that. It's like just the same way I keep track of anybody that makes underground independent hip hop music, because that's the world I'm also in. And I identify with anybody doing that, and I pay attention to it. So I look at and I'm aware of, and I have a relationship with any person doing that. And as many of those people as I can get to know and be close to, I try to do it. So I had Jane Elliott on this podcast, and she's somebody that's been very outspoken since the 60s, since the day after Martin Luther King was killed, was martyred in America. She's been speaking out publicly, and she talks to us about the death threats that she experienced and the times that she thought she was going to die for speaking out all across the country. And I'm friends with people like Tim Wise, who came along, in the late 90s, early 2000s, reading and writing and speaking and teaching and educating on that subject. And a number of, people like Michelle Wolf, as a white woman comedian. She's one of my dear friends. I love Michelle Wolf as much as I love anybody in this world. There's just something very special to me about that woman. And she's funny as hell. She came along as a stone cold comedian, like very serious about writing jokes, and very serious about learning her voice and developing her craft. I've seen her in the trenches honoring that craft. And then she got a bunch of really quick fans for being an outspoken, edgy white woman. And so she said, oh, no, I have critique for white women. I got things I want to say to white women. And so she, as a person that is, the majority of her fan base are white women. tells them the truth in ways that are not comfortable for them, they weren't asking for. And I identify with that. And I love her just for the artist that she is and the human being that she is. But seeing her do that, I really identify with that. And I have to say, I say all the time, of all of the people that are considered to be white, of all of the white people that speak truth to power from within, none of them in my experience are better as a group of people than Jewish people who speak the truth. I've been following this person on Instagram called Sim Kern. Sim is their first name, Kern, Kern. It's a non-binary, I believe. Sim is non-binary. Sim goes by they, them. Jewish American independent author. And I can only imagine how ill the writing must be. I don't know how dope it is. I haven't had the chance because I just became aware of Sim in the last few weeks. But Sim is an incredible truth teller. And I've seen so many people like that. Dr. Gabor Mate, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing the name right. Norman Finkelstein, rabbis, people that I've known that aren't famous, but rabbis that I know that speak out against white supremacist colonialism in any form from within and don't identify with it just because there's a narrative that as a group we're supposed to identify with it. And so I see that in others, and I think very seriously about like, what would that mean? What would it mean if what's happening to the Palestinians what would the analogy be with white Americans? Well, what if somebody said, what if the global community, meaning the big superpowers of the world, were to say that Native people, First Nations people, Indigenous people, American Indians, what if the global community were petitioned by that group of people and said, because of the nightmares that they've experienced and because of their spiritual and historical connection to the land that's now called America, the global community would say that they're going to be given a land and a sovereign country of their own within America, because America is historically their land, that they would be given a country within that land, and that they would be able to finally have a place where they could live, where they could have their culture, where they could have their stories, where they could speak their languages, where they would finally be able to have some sense of security and of some freedom and some ability to be self-determining. That claim is one that would be extremely valid. And so what if that claim was made what if that determination was made by the global community, that there's going to be a part of America now that will be a sovereign nation for First Nations, Indigenous, Native people, American Indians? What if that was the case? And what it would mean is that there would be a part of the country that white Americans had been used to living in. And just assume that it's the place that you live in. So if you live on the East Coast, or if you live in the South or the Southwest, or if you live in the West Coast or in the Midwest or in the Pacific Northwest, any part of the Plain States, wherever you live, imagine that particular place is the place that was determined that it would be now for Native people. And the way that would be done is that, because of what's happened historically, the genocide that was committed on First Nations people, Native people, Indigenous people, First Nations people, American Indians, people call themselves different names, so I try to be respectful of all those names and include them all. But those tribes and those peoples, that they would also, because of the fact that what's been done to them over the years means that they don't have the people and the resources to fight and do that militarily. So the global superpowers of the world would, to the tune of trillions of dollars, give them the resources that they need to do that. And then also the most advanced military weaponry to do that. Talking about airplanes and tanks and guns and bombs and missiles, and that the average person would be supplied with automatic weapons, and that they would have the full right to go and to remove people from their homes. So imagine that you or me and everyone in our state and in our group of states, in our region, was forcefully removed under the threat of the superpowers of the world, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of people, because that's what happened in Palestine in what's called the Nakba. That's what happened. People were removed from their homes. What would be the response of the people? And not only what would be your response, because maybe you're a justice-minded person. Maybe you're a person that wants to share. Maybe you're a person that's always known that something's wrong with America. And maybe you would. Maybe you would go and move and live somewhere else. Maybe you would go to a place where where your home that wasn't your home. Maybe you would relocate. But think about, what would your neighbors do? Think about, what would all of the people in your region do? The people who don't think like you, the people that don't vote like you. What would the response be if somebody literally came to your home and said, you don't live here anymore? The original people of this land live here now. And so you're going to be forced out of here. You're going to go live somewhere else. What would you do? And not only that, but that nation, the First Nation, Indigenous, Native American Indian nation, they would actually control the part of the land that you do live on. And so you actually wouldn't really be able to control your own travel anymore. You wouldn't be able to travel even around from place to place where the other white people live. Your movement would be controlled. Like your physical movement, there would be checkpoints and you wouldn't be able to move. You also wouldn't be able to have your own, airport. You wouldn't be in control of your food supply. You wouldn't be in control of your electricity, your water. That would actually be ruled by the indigenous First Nations Native people. That would be controlled by them. And this military that they had would be supplied to them under the auspices of them needing to protect themselves from you and from the white people who they were forcing out of their homes because of their historic and spiritual claim to the land. What would be the response? What would you do in day one of that? What would you do the day that they showed up? What would you do the first year? What would you do the first decade? What would you want your children to do a few generations from now? Because this is something that's been going on for generations. Would you fight? Would you kill? Would you die? What would be your response? And what would be your neighbor's response? And what if that particular response, and what if those militias, because we know that, there's militias in America. There's militias amongst white folks. And since around 2016, 2017, those have been increasing. People that are trained and people that, go into the woods and train and shoot and learn to fight and defend under the idea of we're defending. What would those people do? And what if that was called terrorism? And what if they did things that you didn't necessarily approve of? And what if the people in our ideological group didn't have training or guns or hadn't been part of a militia? And so the people that are providing some resistance are the people that we don't necessarily agree with. What if we were all defined by whatever militia stepped up to fight that? because that's what's been happening to the Palestinians. And I hear all of this talk about Hamas. And I got to say that like I said, I've lived and known Palestinian people for 30 years now. I've never known anybody who identified with Hamas in a good way. That's just not the conversation. And I wonder why the people who are so obsessed with Hamas, I rarely hear them talk about the Palestinian people. And those who keep track of and speak up for and care about the humanity of Palestinian people, the claim is always made, well, you guys support Hamas, or do you denounce Hamas? And I've had that question asked of me. Do you denounce terrorism? Do you denounce Hamas? So I say, well, okay, I'm an American citizen. My tax dollars don't fund Hamas. So why is that the question that's being asked of me? Stand out for justice as a witness before the divine, even if it's against yourself and your ancestors and your people and your tribe. My tax money has gone to fund the killing of innocent people in Palestine and all over the world. And so that insistence on using the term Hamas instead of Palestinian people or interchangeably with Palestinians is a dehumanization of Palestinian people. And it's related to the fact that, we talked about this last week as well, that when somebody is in a position of oppressor, the people that they're oppressing can only have one of three positions in that worldview and in that arrangement. There are some that will be, most likely, if there's an opportunity, that they will be happy participants and they'll try to be useful because that feels like survival. It feels like if I submit, if I surrender, if I try to be useful to the oppressors, then maybe I'll survive this. So that'll be one of the possible responses. The majority of people will never be considered by the oppressor. They won't be thought about. They won't be thought of. So as somebody that's connected to the Palestinian people and knows them and in community with them, all of us that have been a part of that, have known these stories of journalists that have been killed, of humanitarian groups that have tried to bring just basic human necessities to the Palestinian people and deliver it to them. But they've been arrested and they've been turned away. We have been keeping track of this for our lifetimes. Know that almost unanimously, the global and national human rights groups have said that what's happening to Palestinians is an apartheid. And these are not anti-Semitic, bigoted people. A lot of these organizations are led by Jewish leadership and thought leaders and humanitarians. One of them was actually just denied to do a project at Harvard University because in his work to tell the truth about and to investigate nations and their human rights violations, he said that what's happening to Palestinians is an apartheid. About 10 or 15 years ago, I was approached by a great filmmaker named Jonathan Demme. His son, Ted Demme, is the one that started Yo MTV Raps. And they both have passed away, so may they both rest in peace. But Jonathan Demme directed Philadelphia. He directed Silence of the Lambs. He's one of the most celebrated filmmakers of our generation. Well, he discovered that former President Jimmy Carter, who's a devout Christian, he's been a devout Christian all his life. He had tried to work at one time to broker peace between Palestinians and Israelis. That had been one of the main focuses of his administration. And Jimmy Carter is a really sweet, beautiful person who doesn't have any hate in him. He's a devout Christian who traveled to the region because he sees it as the Holy Land. And what he found there is that Palestinians were experiencing apartheid. This has been almost unanimously the finding and the witnessing of global humanitarian organizations, of people like Nelson Mandela and others. Nelson Mandela was also called a terrorist. He spent 27 years in prison because he was considered a terrorist. And he was on the U.S. terrorist watch list for a decade after he became the president of South Africa. And so Jimmy Carter discovered what he considered to be an apartheid system. And so he wrote a book called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And he basically says to the world, like, this is the condition there. And you can't accept people to accept peace and to just live peacefully when they're being completely oppressed. That's actually asking them to accept violence to be done on them. There's got to be some sovereignty. There's got to be some human dignity. There's got to be some humanity there. And so Jimmy Carter did a book tour, and Jonathan Demme's movie was about him. It's called Man from Plains. And it's about this tour where Jimmy Carter travels around the country talking about the apartheid that he found that Palestinians were living under. And he was just being berated at all of his stops. I mean, people were calling him all types of horrible names. He was receiving all types of threats. People were calling him anti-Semitic and all this stuff. And Jonathan Demme said, I want to use your song, Forrest Whitaker, as the theme song for President Jimmy Carter on this tour. So you got this beautiful, sweet, gentle Christian man traveling around the country in his late 70s with his wife, just trying to tell the truth about what he experienced in Palestine, and people being so cruel to him. And so if you go back and watch this documentary, every time he gets off a plane and people are there picketing him and protesting him and, comparing him to Hitler and all of these things that they're saying about this man, you hear Forrest Whitaker playing, I'm gonna be all right. You ain't gotta be my friend tonight. You ain't gotta love me. It's this really kind of beautiful dichotomy. And so I remember also those of us that were there after 9/11, and we saw this same language and this same type of energy, and we saw this same the type of messaging and fear and dehumanization. And we saw what happened after that. The military drums, the war drums got beat. The military industrial complex got funded. And American forces went to countries that had nothing to do with people who took responsibility for the attacks on 9/11. And they killed 1 million people and destabilized the region even more. And so, I do this podcast because I want to share the human reality by reflecting together with people. And so, I've had all sorts of people on here, and I have reached out to several of the Palestinian people that I know to come on and talk. And I even reached out to, if anybody knows Sim Kern, please let Sim know. I really want to have Sim on this podcast. And there are others. But these folks, understandably, are really busy, and I don't have any sense of expectation or anything like that, entitlement to their time or their attention or anything like that. But what this podcast is about is putting our humanity first, being honest about exploring the human journey and going on the human journey together. And I posted some things for context. Most of what I've been posting on Instagram are Jewish voices doing exactly what I'm talking about here. Really extremely brave Jewish men, women, people from and non-binary people who are telling the truth as they see it, as they understand it, even if it's against themselves, even if it's against the people that they are identified with, even if it's against their own group. And rather than, talk to hip hop artists about what we do, I just wanted to turn this mic on and invite anybody that identifies with me to really think about what would it mean to be in somebody else's shoes. And because of the reality of white supremacist colonialism, it's very difficult for a white person anywhere in the world to even imagine being on the opposite side of that, because the dominant forces around the world have made it so that white people always identify with the oppressor as a group, never as never necessarily every individual. Like I said, I really keep track of and appreciate white people who are able to, in their humanity, resonate with something much more broad than that. To basically reject this idea that because I'm born into this group of people, and I love people, I love my folks, I love my people, but it doesn't mean that I have to support their ideology, the most dominant ideology. It definitely doesn't mean that I have to support whatever the war machine is doing, whatever the colonial project is at the time that's being marketed to my fears, my sympathies, my prejudices, my affinity and love for my community is being marketed in all of these ways. Doesn't mean that I have to sign up for that. And that's what real freedom is about. That's what real humanity is about. And so, in a time like this, I try to think about not what do I want to say, but what do I think might be helpful. And I actually got a message. What I was saying is that when I started posting about this, it's when the war drums were starting to be beat. And when people in these global powers were referring to Palestinian people as human animals, as roaches, as dogs. I mean, look at the language. You see some of their leaders saying, if you tell the truth, if you tell both sides of the story, you're only supporting the terrorists on their side. And you see misinformation and disinformation the same way that's happened in all of these conflicts. You see language that is skewed, language that's meant to deliver a person to a certain opinion. And suddenly you see people on both sides of the political aisle. You see people on both sides of the media that usually argues with each other. You suddenly see them uniting behind this genocide of these human beings. And so it feels like, what I would like to be contributing is these thoughts, these reflections, these messages. I've been reluctant to even get behind the mic. And I don't have what feels like a satisfying endpoint. I don't like to wave flags. I don't like to speak in the language of the debate. I try my best to not use that language. I try to challenge myself to step out of the nomenclature of the conversation. And I would challenge anybody to do that. Whatever your position is in any social debate, can we speak in terms that aren't, can we speak in other terms? Because that really challenges us to engage it on a heart level and on an individual level, and to have some individual thought, But I've also expressed myself in a lot of different ways throughout my career. When I first kind of came onto the national scene, it was during the war years. It was during the Bush years. And I did the song Uncle Sam Goddamn, where I put the message in music and tried to do it in a way that was cool and funky and jazzy and, dope. And that was really well received. And I did experience consequences for that. They let me be on TV for the first time ever, and I insisted on doing that song and talking about those things. And almost immediately I started getting surveilled and uninvited from major business, industry opportunities. And there's always a price to pay for saying something that's unpopular. And once you're labeled in any industry or in any situation, it's almost impossible to shake that label. And so there was a certain label that I got at that time, And what I started to realize is that because my message had been so indirect, that there were people that I didn't agree with reading and projecting their interpretation of what I was saying onto me about all sorts of different issues. And there were people that actually liked and supported me for reasons that I was against. There were people that liked me for racist reasons. There are people that listened to me and my friends' music because they didn't like to hear Black people talk about Black issues in this Black art form. There's always been people that prefer white people making Black music, or just anybody not Black making Black music. And so there were times when I tried to be more, very broad and very open. So I made an album called the Us album, where people also, I found that they were listening to my story and feeling like, man, I listen to your story and I feel like that's me. And I'm looking at them and thinking about my story, and I'm like, I'm a, albino Muslim, single dad, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm looking at, well, how did you see that? Well, because of the human connection in the story. So when I made my album called Us, I started just, instead of talking about what happens to different communities, I just started telling their human stories in a first person account of loving them. And then I went on tour with that album, and it felt like what I was talking about earlier happened even in a more profound way. It felt like people were projecting what seemed like racist ideas onto my music and onto me. And so then I came back and made the Morning in America album, and I said, I'm just gonna bust my gun. I'm just gonna talk my talk. I'm gonna be rough, and I'm gonna make it impossible for people to not know what I'm saying right now. And I made the album, the song Morning in America is basically saying we Americans point their finger at the rest of the world and call people terrorists and call people, and America and the West and white supremacist colonialism is the number one purveyor of violence against innocent people around the world in human history. Dropping bombs on entire populations, nuclear weapons, starving people, destroying people, committing genocide on people. When people hear the word genocide, when white folks hear the word genocide, I think it's lost like what that really is. There are entire groups of people that used to exist that don't exist as a group anymore. There are families that don't exist anymore because they're wiped out. And then they're blamed for because they were resisting the colonial project that was being imposed on them. There are entire groups of people that don't exist anymore. And the fact that it's difficult for white people to see that as a possibility for them feels to me like proof of the colonial white supremacist project and what it does to people's internal sense of self. Like, this has robbed us of our ability to see our own humanity and other people's humanity as what's essential. So it's like humanity itself is low, and then you look at suicide rates and chemical dependency within that community, within the white world. White middle-class men die of suicide in alarming rates. And my father died that way. My grandfather died that way. And I got other people in my family. I made a song called Writer's Block where I was very open about having a suicidal moment. And I couldn't say it in that song, but that's the year that my dad died of suicide. And it's only a couple years after my grandfather died the same way. I've never seen a man in my family, the men that I descend from, all died at their own hands. I have also another song about it called Out of Here. And it feels to me, like Dave Chappelle said, he said, he was talking about a friend of his that went through all these terrible things in his life. Never occurred to him to commit suicide, to kill himself. But he was talking about Anthony Bourdain, who had the coolest job and the coolest life and all this stuff. And I really feel like my father could not accept the very human things that he was experiencing. The basic human frailty of addiction and struggling with mental health stuff. These are things that most of the world deals with and understands that this is part of being a human being. But in this context of what it's supposed to mean, my father wanted so badly to be a middle-class, suburban white man with a picture-perfect family and life, so much so that when it didn't work out, he would leave that family and go to another suburb and start another family. He did this multiple times, and eventually his addictions and his just human stuff just got hold of him, and he wrote a letter to his wife, and he crashed his car into a bridge. And that's how he died. And I can't shake the feeling that the sense that he was somehow supposed to be above this human stuff, and specifically that he was aiming for the suburbs and he could never make it work. My whole life, we went back and forth between living in little beat up apartments and saving money to try to get to the suburbs, and then move to a house in the suburbs and lose that house and lose that job based on the struggles of addiction and mental health stuff. And then we'd be back in the hood, or we'd be back in a little apartment, or we'd be back amongst, working class and working poor white people trying to save and trying to get back to those suburbs. And just seeing the way that impacted my father, also along with being albino and along with people's confusion about what albinism is. I didn't mean to make this about me, but I'm just sharing this stuff because this is a very sincere, real thing for me. And so this idea and this sickness, this dehumanizing idea of whiteness is affecting everybody involved. But the fact that people could never see themselves being on the other side of that, and the extreme violence that's being carried out. And what I was saying before I got off on a tangent is that the song in the album Morning in America, Mourning, is about the fact that while pointing its finger at everybody else, white global supremacy, colonial projects have been the most violent people in human history. Nobody has killed innocent people the way that particular conception of life has done. And people point their fingers at religion, and people point their fingers at all these other things. Nothing has been as deadly as this worldview and its relationship with technology, its relationship with science, the whitening of religions. That the power, the center of power around these religions that did not start in the European world, but somehow became white religion. I see it, to me, it's very, very clear. And to the non-white world, what they maybe call the global South, this is a very, very, very clear picture that the world has. So even when people use language like the global community, I'm sorry, it's not the global community. It's the white power elite colonial project that is the global community of that worldview. And I got a lot of homies and people and friends, and I do not require somebody to see the world the same as I do in order for me to love them and in order for me to be in community with them. And so I got a lot of friends, white friends, Muslim friends, that were looking to certain uh, to certain people, certain conservative social commentators, and really liking some of the things that they said. And the Islamic tradition predates this modern conception of the left and the right, of progressive Democrats, liberals, whatever, and on the one hand, and maybe conservative, Republican, and you can't just use all these terms interchangeably. The kind of like the people that would consider themselves to be anti-woke. The Islamic tradition predates all of that. And so neither of those are ideas or concepts that I identify with completely. And so when Muslims that are really, rooted and grounded in our tradition, we're going to hear things on both sides of those conversations that resonate with us. And both sides of those conversations are going to be missing things that are important to us. But for me, when I hear somebody doing social commentary and talking about the ills of modern life, and they don't include white supremacy, racism in that, when they didn't start tracking the problems in the world until they started experiencing things that other people have experienced for years. We say, like, there's not enough freedom of speech. You know what I mean? You get roasted for telling your truth, and you can lose your career, and you can lose your reputation, and you can be canceled and kicked out of society for not having the right opinions and for saying things that feel very true to you. Yeah, that's what oppressed people have always experienced, and even anybody that stands with them. And none of these people went through what Paul Robeson went through. And do people even know who Paul Robeson is? Because this is a person who stood up against a lot of the things that white podcast hosts are talking about. He stood up against those things as a black man that America loved, a classically trained, operatic, beautiful singer. The man is saying Old Man River and whatnot. He stood up against those things in the 40s. And they banned him, boycotted him, wouldn't let him perform, and then they took away his passport so he couldn't perform anywhere else. And he died poor and penniless and being cast out of society. You look at what was done to people like Nina Simone. Look what was done to Harry Belafonte. Read Harry Belafonte's memoir. That he was working with people like Martin Luther King. Look at what they did to Martin Luther King, the counterintelligence program. Look at what they did to Martin Luther King. Look what they did to these people who were completely nonviolent. The FBI, the CIA, the counterintelligence program, they infiltrated Harry Belafonte, this mixed race man who's saying, daylight come and me want go home. But he was in line with and he was supporting Dr. Martin Luther King in that particular wing of civil rights. He wasn't a Malcolm X person. He wasn't a Black Panther. He was supporting Martin Luther King, and he was supporting the arts. And they sent in people to infiltrate this man, a husband and wife. The husband posed as his accountant. The wife posed as his therapist. And these people tried to destroy this man's life. This is real, like being canceled. Like, this is a different level. A show promoter threw a concert at Carnegie Hall, and Harry Belafonte, who was one of the most beautiful singers and actors, went in and he was experiencing vocal trouble, just like most of us performers do. And they brought in a surgeon that cut the polyps off his vocal cords, and he sang that night and he lost his voice forever. And these were related to the counterintelligence program, plants that were put in him. I mean, these things are well documented facts. In the Freedom of Information Act, Mr. Belafonte, may he rest in peace, was able to uncover that this was a very real thing that happened to him. Paul Robeson, Nina Simone, people that spoke out and told truth. These weren't violent people. They spoke out and told their truth, and they were literally canceled, and they were literally expelled. So when a middle-aged, successful white man says that he's being canceled for his views, Some of the views I might agree with. I might like some. I like stuff that all these guys say. There are things that all of them say that I like, and I even like some of those people. Sometimes I enjoy hearing them talk, but I'm always aware of the fact that they didn't start paying attention to those injustices until they were done to them. And it doesn't really matter to them that people of color before them for generations had far worse things happen to them. You know, so when somebody says, "Oh, well, good night, I'm being canceled," I'm sorry, was your passport taken away? Did somebody pose as like the main people in your life? Were there plants put in your life to destroy your finances, to create a tax fraud situation for you? You know, and what's being done to them, to some of them, is wrong. But I've noticed a lot of people that are really having moments of feeling great sadness with folks that are now taking certain positions. I mean, there are people talking about the Palestinians and saying, finish them, level Gaza. And they almost never say Palestinian people. They almost never use the word people. They never speak in human terms. They refer to all of those people as Hamas. And why? Because from a colonialist, dehumanizing mindset, those people only become a factor when they harm us, if they put fear in us, if they attack, or in that perspective, it would be fight back. If they fight back in a way that strikes fear into us. And so over and over and over again, part of the human experience of being demoralized, dehumanized, oppressed, forgotten about, colonized, there are always groups that spring up from among those people that say that recognize the only thing that these colonizers understand is violence. The only thing that reaches them, our cries don't reach them. Our dying children don't reach them. Our starving doesn't reach them because they don't see us as human. The only thing that actually touches them is to hurt them and to hurt their money. To harm them physically or to hurt their money. And so, of course, it's wrong for a human being to kill or to harm innocent human beings. Of course, that's wrong. But how do you dictate to a person who finds themselves in that situation, and in every single case, somebody has met it with resistance? And think about what would happen if that were done in America. Think about what would happen if white Americans ever found themselves in that situation. What would the response be? What would the response be? You know, what have we seen the response be when somebody attacks? I mean, what happened? So that's all I got is just focusing on the human experience. You know, I said I didn't want to make this about me, but so you know, I came out and did Uncle Sam Goddamn and Undisputed Truth, and there was a bunch of personal stuff on there. And then I did the Us album, trying to see, can I expand this human relatability thing to the other people in my life that I know? Because I was raised in Black families and Black communities and Muslim communities. Those are the people that believed in me. Those are the people that trained me and taught me and made me believe that I could be a human being and that I could make a go of it in life. That's my experience. And so, can I tell their stories just as me loving them? I don't even try to tell them from a third person perspective. I tell the stories as a first person account of someone loving them, experiencing them, and witnessing their pain and trying to share that on a human level. So then that didn't feel like it was effective. And so I did Morning in America, where I come out, just look, this is what it is, you know? And I got death threats. And I had people threaten to harm me, and I know for a fact that was at the industry height of my career. And I know very specifically that there are people that didn't book me for things. I know very specifically that there were music and entertainment industry people that made decisions to not include me in things. And I knew that it would happen, and it was a cost price that I was willing to pay. I also have been surveilled, harassed. The attempts have been made to intimidate me and my family. I know that that's also true. That's something that I've lived with. But my heroes have gone through far worse. So I say this not to make it about me, but then the last project that I did, All the Beauty in This Whole Life, the last major release, was about the spiritual, to just say like, okay, what if we just talk about, does life have meaning? Is there a world of meaning that's beyond, that we can agree on that? Can we just agree on the life of meaning? Now, for me, that's going to be through the lens of this global tradition that I'm part of, this global wisdom tradition, spiritual tradition, healing tradition, religious tradition of Islam. And so can I present Islam as being next to other wisdom traditions and spiritual traditions that are good for people? People have a sense that Buddhism and meditating and yoga is good for people. So I just presented Islam next to that. And it's also true that Buddhists have territories and countries, and that Buddhists have actually, there have been Buddhist countries and military projects that have committed atrocities against other people. It's true. That's a true thing that's happened in the world. So can I just present Islam like that? But then this element of the journey and this podcast and the music that I'm making, and there's music coming, but this has been about the travel of life, going through life and sharing that with other people based on the humanity of it. So there are people in here that I don't agree with everything they say, everything they do, everything they believe in. I don't agree with everything that everybody has said. And there are a lot of people that agree with everything they've said on this show too. But the idea is to relate to one another based on the humanity. And when it really matters, to acknowledge the humanity and lead with the humanity of people that are being dehumanized and being viewed as not human. That means something. To me, there's something special about that. And I don't like all this like focus on entertainers and their personal lives. And I wouldn't even bring this up if it wasn't for something very beautiful being said here. So, the Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, the whole odyssey of what has been going on with them, and there's all of that. And it's not interesting to me, except for the fact that Will Smith stood up in public and said, I made a commitment to myself and asked myself a very serious question years ago. Can I love another human being no matter what? Can I love this human being, my wife, no matter what? Can I show up for her? Can I be there for her? Can I look at what I have to give? I'm not going to be able to give everything she wants. I'm not going to be able to give her. He also said at one point, I retired from trying to make you happy. He said that publicly. But he said, can I show up for another person no matter what? And what I see in that is that this moment might be specifically difficult and painful for him to do that. And I'm not weighing in on, it's just so corny to weigh in on other people's lives or to have opinions about other people's lives. I really dislike that. I think it's a sickness of the heart to want to focus on other people and their personal business and to have opinions about them. And I think it's a disease of our time that we do that. I think that's a sickness that we should not do. Hyper-focus on things that aren't our business while we take the focus off of things that are our business. I think that's a disease. And so I have no desire to talk about that or play into that. But I will say that the statement that man made is very powerful. And I would just say that with what else, and people are saying, well, why are they talking about this during the time that, what's happening in Palestine? There's a genocide happening in Palestine. Why are we talking about this? And I will say that particular statement that he made, I will extend it and say, can you and I see ourselves in everybody involved? And can we see the humanity of other people completely, regardless of what our affiliations are, regardless of what the news and the narrative is about them? Can we see them as human, no matter what? So that's what I got. And it feels like I'm just gonna sit here by myself in this office in Istanbul at 11 at night and just say that I don't think I'm gonna talk until I feel satisfied. And so I guess end with what I always end with, that the work continues, the work on self continues, the work continues of showing up how and when it's best and most needed. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.